So my opinion on this is that it's very sad and it's very infuriating in a lot of ways, right? Because censorship, right? A lot of people talk about censorship as this broad, just universal thing, and right, some people call themselves free speech absolutists, and I can respect that to a certain degree. But I think what we're seeing here in this particular instance is that not just that we need to defend those who are being suppressed ourselves, those who are trying to get out an alternative narrative, but we also have to talk about our security, our capacity to do this work. How do we protect ourselves? How do we ensure that we are able to continue to do this work under really warlike conditions? Because that's how I see all of this. I mean, class struggle is war, right? And this is part of it. This is part of a class struggle. It's part of imperialism attempting to keep control of the narrative. And so, one thing that I always think about in these moments too is how countries like Iran, like Russia, and especially China have operated in this environment of intense repression, of intense imperialist aggression. And I think about how there was a lot of talk among some friends and comrades of ours about China when Russia was cut off from MasterCard, was cut off from Google Pay, and all of these things. And a lot of people started to have disruptions in their just public affairs. They couldn't take transportation, they couldn't use their cards anymore. It was a disaster. And people were talking about how, well, in China, right, WeChat Pay and these kind of institutions, Alipay, you don't have to worry about that. And so that gets me thinking about this great firewall, and people criticize it all the time. Oh, well, Google and Facebook and YouTube can't operate in China, and is what makes it repressive, right? That's what makes it anti-free speech. But now I think about the situation wherein now, where information is controlled in these private hands, and now these private hands are saying, we're not allowed to talk about certain things or we're going to take you off. I start to think about how China is actually very smart and how these other countries are smart to not allow private Western foreign imperialist media corporations, big tech corporations dominate their political and economic landscape, because that makes it just that much harder for them to remain sovereign, independent, and to continue on with their own pathways for how to develop and organize their societies free of aggression. And so I think that's why free speech is complex. And I said that free speech never existed in the United States. And I don't think we can deny that, given that the United States was founded upon one of the most brutal systems of colonialism and chattel slavery that capitalism has ever wrought upon the planet. But we also have to understand that this saying that is not to say that we shouldn't defend people who are being repressed right now, right? We shouldn't defend RT. We shouldn't defend people who've lost their jobs, people, journalists, those outlets who are maybe affiliated with Iran and Russia, but have actually given platforms to a lot of alternative and independent voices. That we shouldn't defend them, or we shouldn't defend Julian Assange, or we shouldn't defend anyone who has attempted to get the truth out about empire, about war, about capitalism, about white supremacy, what have you, right? Of course we should defend them, and we should defend them. Of course we should defend them on their right to do this, on their right to speak, right? But I think that there's a difference between this concept of free speech, which was a concept created by European bourgeois, Western, and American imperialists. It was a right for them to have, so they could have maximal say, the maximum say in how affairs were dictated, both the state level, the government level, at the economic level, social level. It was all about maintaining their interests, right? And extending that to however many people was necessary to maintain their rule. But that's not really what free speech is. And I don't think that's what many people think free speech is. I think for people really do think that free speech is this pluralistic thing where everyone has it and it's endowed to you as a human. And sure, it could be considered this universal human right in the abstract sense, but when you live under a system of very specific and concrete social relations, you have to operate and understand yourself and position yourself within that. And so that's what I mean by free speech has never existed, because unless we live in a society where there isn't a class above a class, right? Where there isn't class rule, then we're not going to have free speech for everybody. And this includes on the socialist side, right? I don't support anyone who says that Cuba should open their doors to right-wing media. We've seen what that's done in Venezuela, right? I don't believe that Cuba should do that. I think Cuba should make sure that right-wing media that calls for the overthrow of the revolution and undermines the revolution at any cost, I don't believe that they should get rid of that restriction on free speech, right? So everything is political. And this is what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with a political assault on those who speak out against empire. That is what the banning of RT is. That is what taking RT America and shutting it down, right? That's what this all is about. So we have to make sure that not only are we talking about how that is wrong, how that is against the interests of the people, it's against the interests of peace, but we also have to be clear about the politics of all this, right? Who is spearheading this charge to suppress the right of independent journalists to do what they need to do, right? To do what they should be doing, which is exposing power and ensuring that people are informed about how their government, how their society operates. That is the duty of independent journalism. That the first duty is to the truth. And when you have a state, when you have an imperialist state like the United States, like its imperialist allies, when you have these governments so willing to suppress speech that they don't like, suppress content that they don't like, suppress ideas that they don't like, and honestly suppress the truth, which of course they don't like, then it makes independent journalism incredibly difficult to undertake. And that's been my experience. My experience is that independent journalism is an incredibly difficult task. It's an incredibly difficult job, if we call it a job in the career sense. Essentially, independent journalism is an impossible job in that way because there aren't many people who are willing to employ you to do that work. I mean, RT, Press TV, these outlets were some of the few that ever extended any kind of offers in that way, right? Only international media has ever really done that because a lot of US based outlets just don't have the resources, right? To elevate voices like ours, to elevate anti-imperialist voices. And so that is something that the imperialists well understand. This is about cutting off our channels to getting information out there. It is to isolate us further as the United States, NATO, the EU, as they figure out what they want to do to Russia, right? And this is the scary part about it, is that not only, and this is always the case, not only is it about suppressing dissenting voices, anti-imperialist voices, but it's also about figuring out and biding time to figure out what are we going to do to Russia? What are we going to do in this war? How are we going to assert dominance, assert hegemony, ensure that our interests are met in a period where any kind of escalation by the United States and NATO and the EU only prolongs this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So, I mean, those are my initial thoughts. I'll continue on. I'll probably stay on here for an hour or so. Please do like the stream while you're here. For those of you who are here, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. And the way that you support this show and the way you can support independent journalists all over who are losing their jobs, who are trying to do it on their own, like I am, on a full-time basis, and who are facing the censorship, which to a lesser degree I am facing it. to those folks like RT, those who work for RT America, etc. But you can support this channel, this work at patreon.com/Danny Hai Fong. Patreon.com/Danny Hai Fong. So let's just continue on here. So yeah, I mean, it's it's quite the situation to be in, and I think that we're all trying to understand how to move forward, right? And I think there are those who say, okay, we got to go onto these alternative platforms, and I'm definitely considering that. But I also think that there's another element to this and just moving on to another platform where we can all be. I think we also have to work together and be in solidarity with each other. And I hope that this moment fuels solidarity among independent journalists, especially those of us on the left who share a worldview and who share common interests for peace, against the anti-imperialism, and some kind of socialism, if we have any agreement on that, as well as all of the issues that we may agree upon or not that fall under those umbrellas, right? I think that's really what we need. And it's a very difficult thing, right, to do because there's so much work to do. If you are, for example, like myself, I find this very difficult when you're trying to write columns, when you're trying to do streams like this, when you're trying to just put out work that you're doing. There isn't always a lot of time to for that collaboration. There isn't always a lot of space or energy for that collaboration. And so it does take a more mass effort to make it happen. It does take people who are willing to help put in that work to get that done. And so that is one of my hopes from here on out, is that these are conditions that are really crying for more collaboration. They're crying for more unity and solidarity among independent media and left independent media, content creators, journalists, those of us who are creating, dare I say, propaganda for the people, right? The people's propaganda, that propaganda which tells the truth. And there's a lot of people that think propaganda is just all lies, right? Because we often use it in this negative tone. But actually, propaganda, I think that comes from a little bit of an anti communist root where the agitation and the education that socialist movements, socialist countries, anti colonial movements put out was called propaganda by those who were against it, right? By the colonialists and the imperialists during the Cold War. That's really where the root of this propaganda comes from in the negative light. But it's not just one single thing. Propaganda is simply disseminating information based on based on what your interests are. So if your interests are in the truth, if your interests are the betterment and the liberation of working people and oppressed people, then your propaganda is going to reflect that. If it's to reproduce a system of exploitation like imperialism that relies on endless war and austerity and super exploitation and the theft of the wealth of the vast majority of humanity and the destruction of the planet through climate catastrophe, then your propaganda is going to reflect that. And that's why the propaganda on that side happens to be rife with lies, distortions, half truths, and exaggerations, all for the purpose of reproducing that reality, right? So we are in a moment where we are under attack. And as I said before, I don't know how long this channel has. I don't know how long, we all have on these platforms, those of us who are putting out this narrative, because this isn't going to be the only time. Okay. So the Russia Ukraine war is a flashpoint. I've been saying this since it began.